having me today to chat about Shelter 2.0 and its applicability in today's COVID world. So some of you on the call may not be familiar with Shelter 2.0, some of you might be. I'm going to give a high-level overview of what the findings were and then walk you through how that is applying in today's pandemic situation and how it sort of helped us navigate some of the challenges that we're facing with the COVID-19 situation. Hang on, I've got to figure out how to, there we go. Okay, so as mentioned, the original authors, yeah, so I'm not very polished sometimes. Sherry's laughing at me. So I'm just like, I'm just going to say what's happening right now on my screen. But so the original authors from the project, as mentioned, were Heather Morley. She was at YW at the time, myself, Lana Wells, and Dr. Lena Turner. So this really was a collaborative project. It was not led by any one agency. Today I'm going to walk you through a little bit about the background of the Shelter 2.0 project, the 4 main findings and their applicability of during the COVID situation, and then how that also affects relaunch and recovery and how we're moving into a new normal, blending this Shelter 2.0 project with situating an agency that's needing to respond in a pandemic situation. Before I get going on the findings, though, I wanted to clarify a few things and set the context so that people are not, misled or think that this project was meant to be something across the province or representative of everybody. I'll address it a few times through the presentation. There was a fair bit of controversy around Shelter 2.0, which I can talk about as we go. But really clearly, this project was Calgary-based. It was not ever meant to be a provincial project. It was not, it didn't, and you'll hear when I talk about how it started, why that is. And it was never meant to speak to and be representative for the province. I also want to acknowledge that as we walk through this, that we know that most commonly women are victims in family violence and abuse. And although there are some recommendations around this that look at how to work with men differently, that is just a part of this work. We acknowledge and recognize that this primarily women are the victims that we see. I also want to acknowledge the important role and history of shelters. So I lead a shelter right now, shelter organization, and there were shelters involved in this project. And this project was not about disproving shelters or saying that they don't work or anything. This project was really about understanding and learning what works in shelter, what works best in shelter, and then how do we grow that. And I want to also honor that the shelter movement and the evolution over time really provided a great foundation for the work that we're doing now. And I also want to acknowledge that we're facing, at the time of Shelter 2.0 was released a couple of years ago, I already was saying we were facing a new transformation around digital at that time, and now here we are living it all together in maybe a far more, a faster pace than we ever really hoped. So it's here, and so there are some interesting lessons from Shelter 2.0. So the project and how it started was really, so I came to CWES about 6.5 years ago. And when I first started the job, people would say to me, well, shelter saves lives. Shelter is, an amazing, they're great projects and so on. And then I had someone ask me one day, well, how do you know? And I thought, oh, they're right. Like, how do I know that shelter actually saves lives and how does it work? And so I started digging in to look at the literature and research that was within the organization, and started to realize that it was fairly dated. It was about 8 to 10 years old at that time, which meant that the data was probably a few years older than that. And so I made a few calls to some key people in this sector, and often the answer was, well, we just know it works, and they would tell a story, and a story about someone that the shelters made a difference in their life and saved their life, which was all wonderful. But I really struggled to find outcomes and information and data that said to me, this is how it works, this is why it works, and it was sort of a very muddy picture. And it was one that, if you ask the question, does shelter work, you were often faced with a lot of anger because it was, how dare you question such an important resource. And so that kind of piqued my interest, because if there's something there that's really challenging for people, it always makes me think, well, maybe there's more here to understand and to know. And so I started asking, how does shelter work? Does shelter work? How, what makes it great? And I, still wasn't getting great answers. And so I thought, well, why don't I pull together a group of people maybe other shelters are feeling the same way. And maybe we need to think about this differently. And so we did pull together a group, I'm just going to move ahead to the next slide, a group of local experts that we called a think tank of sorts. And those individuals were involved in second stage shelter, emergency shelter, government, non-shelter-based services, homelessness, and all sorts of walks of life within our broader sector. And as we talked and shared experiences of the shelter world, we realized that it was going to be a longer journey, that it wasn't just a simple, oh, you put these things in place and then shelter's more effective. It was, we reached the point where we understood that there was this intersectionality that needed to be explored, as well as recognizing that a lot of policies and procedures and, at the provincial level and national level had changed over the years, and some parts of shelter really hadn't. And so we started to get curious about, the evolution and how that has happened and how that was serving us. So we decided to dig deeper, and that led to a project that you see today with the paper that was released. And so we actually engaged in a fairly in-depth data review of the data from the Calgary Women's Emergency Shelter as well as the YW Calgary, which I would just note that also was a pretty major step for us to be able to be vulnerable with each other and share our data about what was working and what wasn't with someone outside of your agency. So data is a very sensitive topic right now. There's lots of conversation about it in the province. And we decided to take that risk to share that with each other for the purpose of improving our service for the clients that we served. So we ended up having 4 key findings or key shifts, as you'll see in the paper. And the first one is taking a broader worldview, inclusive practices. Now, traditionally, shelters, and mine was no different at the time, traditionally, shelters work mostly with women and children, and they might have a men's program attached, but generally, that's the main approach. And what we found is that the shelter outcomes that were best, and this was from the literature review as well as our data, were from situations where shelters or organizations were able to really involve all family members. And that was meaning partners, perpetrators, in a safe way, of course, but also extended family and friends. So the bystander piece became evident that it was really important in making shifts and changes that were effective for clients. We saw that you needed to shift practices to be trauma-informed, response-based, and also consider family systems analysis. And this was interesting because over the years, family violence work had really moved away from family systems because of the risk that was perceived that you're putting people at when you would intervene with more than just 1 or 2 family members. And it also, we talked about, what we found is that you needed to prioritize gender and cultural diversity. So you needed to really you would be most effective if you were responsive to those differences. And partnerships and collaboration needed to be intentional and responsive. So not just in response to a funding call or, someone's telling you that you have to partner in a certain area, but real true partnership where agencies were working together around wrapping around services around clients rather than just focusing on what their ownership of that client might be. The second key shift that we found was that shelters, we call it shelter without walls. So the right service at the right time. This one was a little bit more controversial because it talked about really moving from being facility-centered to being client-centered. So for so many years, shelters were seen as a hub and they are a very important resource, but as a main resource. As we've seen funding be released for intensive case managers and other positions attached to shelter, you start to see that the shelter becomes part of a continuum rather than the source of all the services. And what we found in the outcomes is that clients did far better when we, and this is a word people don't like to hear, but when we triaged. And when we actually dug in and assessed with people what their needs really were, what their risk really was, and what services they needed when. And so what we found is that when people would call our crisis lines or our admission lines, sometimes people would not realize how high their risk really was. And I think this will be common experience for all of you on the phone if you've dealt with any of this kind of work. Sometimes clients don't realize how much they are really at risk. So that might be a client that actually does need shelter, but they are not calling for shelter. And so that first conversation becomes really important to really assess that risk and move them along to being able to see the need for a higher intensity resource. As well as some people might be calling and saying they need shelter, but are they at imminent risk? And is that the right resource for now? So those conversations on those helplines and crisis lines really mattered in terms of outcome for clients. And again, that was a really controversial one. People don't like to think about shelters triaging, and traditionally shelters work on a first come first serve basis as long as there is a match. So that was really about decoupling shelter from the outreach services, and also creating a better standalone assessment process. Shift number 3 was that one agency can't do it all. And this one, I love this one. I think this is a great one. I love the term system of care approach, because it really does speak to where no one agency is an island, and that it is our responsibility to coordinate our services. When someone enters one of our agencies, it should not be that they are a CWES owned client. It really needs to be, how do we organize ourselves behind the scenes so that it's seamless for people. And I think when I get to the COVID response piece, you'll see how that really becomes critical and helps be successful when things change in the context that you can't predict. And so there really does need to be coordination of crisis lines, coordination of intakes, and wraparound services for clients that, if you can't serve them, how are you handling that referral? How are you leaving that client in a lurch to make a million more phone calls? Are you connecting them in with other services? How are you doing that? And so the project really found that client outcomes improved considerably when there was someone who took a more active role in connecting them into a service, a system of care. The fourth key shift was that shelters aren't enough. And this isn't meant to say that shelters aren't good, or shelters, aren't an important part of the continuum, because they are. But what this finding is that shelters need to be embedded amongst agencies and services that support their work, and that we have better outcomes when there is a coordinated prevention continuum as well as shelter. Recognizing that in our work, prevention has lots of different definitions, and you could look at prevention at different points along the continuum of engaging with clients, and that shelters really aren't the answer alone. And so we found that when some people just saw shelter as, that's all you need is the shelter, the outcomes weren't as solid if you actually had prevention programs operating or connections with agencies that are doing that kind of work. And so that was a significant learning for this project as well. So responses to the innovation and how COVID-19 has changed that. So when Shelter 2.0 came out, there was a lot of there were a lot of unhappy people that didn't like the project, but please go and read it. It's really not that controversial. But some of the key findings that created a lot of conversation and discussion at the time are actually alive and well now, especially in the time of COVID. And so men in shelter was a huge issue around Shelter 2.0. One of the main findings that came out of this is that if you really want great outcomes for kids in particular, you need to engage their dads. And so I want to point out too that the YW and CWES, we each have taken different parts of Shelter 2.0 and applied them within our context differently. So the things I'll talk about today, like in this, are really about CWES focused, and the YW's had a bit of a different process with theirs. And so we looked at men working in shelter, we looked at sheltering men, and then we also looked at what happens when you engage dads at intake. So one of the findings in the project was that a partner was more dangerous if the police come, and you think about this, it's quite logical. If police come and a woman leaves the situation, she takes her kids, the man's left behind, doesn't know where they are, he's got no resources around him, he's isolated, alone, and he's just lost his family. Versus someone who has, the shelter reaches out to them, engages them around the plan for their kids, offers them resources and support. And of course, this is done after we've assessed the risk, because this isn't something that happens with every partner. But who's going to be less dangerous? It's going to be the guy that has the resources, right? And that has the support and has some information about his kids. He may not need to know everything, but there is a piece around that engagement that reduces risk for women. So how this has changed a little bit with COVID is that there used to be a real pushback on that kind of strategy, even though we're finding it's quite successful. But now, in the time of COVID, with the difficulties people had in reaching out to get services and really connect in and share what was happening for them when they were in self-isolation and social distancing, was that we actually have had an increase in men seeking support and resources since COVID. We've been monitoring our intake line very day to day, and looking at all our program stats. The men's program in the very beginning jumped 34% in the first week of COVID, looking for supports. So I think what it does, it speaks to that importance of, if your agency is not working with men, you need to be partnering with an agency that is, because that family angle becomes really, really important if you're going to make significant and intentional, meaningful change with a family. Triage also becomes really important. I think we've learned, so some shelters were not very full at different points during COVID, understandably, because it's difficult for people to get out and leave and make those phone calls. So triage becomes a really, really important skill for your agency to have. If you can't use certain services, and how do you help people when they reach out, find safety in place? So I think a lot of agencies were dealing with that. And then, of course, the system of care idea, that COVID has really required us to work more closely together and coordinate, because our clients that we're trying to connect with are struggling to reach out to us. And so how do we as a group of agencies make sure that it is as easy as possible for them to access and navigate our services? We shouldn't need to be hiring 1 million navigators for people. It should be our job to figure it out behind the scenes. And so I think we really saw that with COVID. So when you think about how Shelter 2.0 really did impact how we were positioned, how CWES was positioned for when COVID-19 hit, and how it it helped us, I think, be ready for different parts of this this situation. Shelter 2.0 really is about moving from a program mindset to a client-centered approach. And I would say that programs have their place, absolutely, and services. One of the things that we learned about programs, especially once COVID started, was that programs really are built to serve the bulk of clients in that bell curve, in the middle curve, right? And they're an industrial model. So they're built to serve and serve and serve, and you keep offering your program, and let's fill your program, let's get intakes, rather than a service approach or an engagement approach. And COVID really required agencies to think differently. When you couldn't offer your programs in the same way that you did before, you had to rethink it. Now, the simple part really is the digital part. And that's where so many people have paid attention to, oh, we'll just move everything digitally. It's actually that, sure, there's platforms to be considered, and confidentiality and access and all of those things are important things to consider. But for me, the biggest learning that's applicable from Shelter 2.0 is really around engagement. So if you can switch everything to digital, but if you haven't engaged your people about what really matters or is meaningful to them around change, they're not going to show up, or you're going to get maybe not the people that really need your service. You might get people that are very tech savvy and like those kinds of programs, but how are we reaching out to those that are then lost in this COVID world? And so engagement is a word that I use a lot in our agency. If anyone's familiar with Scott Miller's work with the International Center for Clinical Excellence, engagement, engagement, engagement. And so we have worked really hard to make sure that we are connecting with real people that we serve, not just service providers, to give us feedback on how we're doing, how are these evolutions in programs and services working, how are we being meaningful and providing something useful to people, and not just carrying on with just adapting the same program to be digital, but how does it need to shift and what's different, because the needs have changed so significantly for the people that we serve out there. I really believe that our community is different, it's going to be different, and so how do we as service providers really challenge ourselves to also be different? So moving away from we've always done it this way, and rethinking our approach to how we include client voices, and so it's not just advisories, but really at the beginning of a setup of something. But how do you keep the client voice alive throughout your service transformation and your service evolution? And I think that was one of the biggest lessons from Shelter 2.0, because we went and we talked to clients. There were so many focus groups, current, past clients, and we're asking them what worked in Shelter, what didn't. And so that we've carried forward at CWES and try very hard to make sure that we're hearing client voices. If any of you remember the One Line initiative, which is still alive and well, but it's renamed something else. But originally, service providers had asked the shelters to get coordinated with one phone number. And so we went off to say, okay, yeah, we need to do this. And we did all sorts of focus groups and talked to people, and all the service providers wanted one phone line. But when we talked to clients, the clients told us, we don't want one phone line because we might have a relationship with the Y, or we might have a relationship with Wheatland. And so we don't want to change the number we call. You guys have to get organized. And so that client voice was privileged, and it changed the project. And so I think Shelter 2.0 ties in with that as well, is that in the world of COVID, we don't know how this is going to go or what's going to happen next. And so it really is important to have some mechanisms to make sure you're getting real, valuable client feedback. Finding ways to include all family members. And this might mean you might have to work outside your comfort zone with another organization. For example, if your organization doesn't work with men, can you partner with someone that does? Are there ways to create that system of care? And we've seen it. It's been really pretty amazing to watch the partnerships that have come out of Impact and out of CWC and the larger groups, and the shared learning situations has been amazing to watch, because I think that really is that at work, that agencies are seeing that they can't be everything to everybody. And so how do they connect with each other and work well to make sure that no one gets missed in this? We need to create a more seamless experience for clients. And so I talked about that a bit already, that it really isn't just about moving your services to online. It's about how do you consider that whole client experience, and how do you transform how you work with people digitally. And I know that a lot of my staff were struggling with, you're not face-to-face, right? You can't. And so the engagement piece and the outreach, it's almost has to be aggressive, right? And so when shelters numbers were dropping, CWES, we were slow for a couple of weeks, but we were a lot fuller than other shelters at different points. And I think that's partially because we were very aggressive with our outreach. We were trying to get the message out as much as we could, try to create different avenues that people could connect with us and come in safely. And so it really is about creating as many ways in as you can into our system. Another application from COVID and Shelter 2.0 is you really can't own the client. We have a very competitive environment for funds, and I think it's going to get more competitive as resources dry up in this pandemic. And so we're going to have to partner differently, and there's some things we're going to have to stop doing. What Shelter 2.0 taught us, there were things that we had to stop doing in our processes, and there were things that we had to do more of. And I think that's very much what we're going to see happening as the world starts to relaunch and reopen, is how do you share resources differently with your collaborative agencies. And Shelter and other resources need to be connected. It's a call to really look at our intake approaches, making sure there's right matching, and there's that ugly word again, triaging, but it really is about connecting people to the right service at the right time. And in some ways, this digital response that people have been taken on has moved agencies closer too. There's been far more connections on Zoom, lots of these learning opportunities, and so I think that the sector is really well positioned to even go further down that road. And then I think the other finding from Shelter 2.0 was that, you know, prevention and intervention are actually intertwined. There really shouldn't be a fight between the different levels, right? It's a fake dichotomy. And so how do we, as agencies and service providers and partners, hold that gently, that we're actually always doing both? Like, even if you're a shelter, you're still doing some prevention, right? There's still that overlap. And, you know, I think prior to COVID-19, we talked a lot about how that's different. And I think we saw it a bit amplified in the first stages, when there were lots of calls from the province, you know, mandatory calls for the shelters to get on the line. But and it was later that they realized, wait a second, we need all the agencies on the line and on these calls. And that's because it really is, we have to all be working together on this. And then again, engagement, I can't say it enough, that Shelter 2.0 taught us that our clients often have a different perspective that we aren't aware of, and we've never stopped to ask. And so I think it's really important, as you move into the COVID response and the relaunch, that you're asking your clients, you're finding ways for them to give you real feedback, and that you're willing to shift and change based on that feedback. I think that's really key to being successful in making any change. And then I would also say data. And this is a hot topic right now in the province. But I would say that Shelter 2.0 really emphasized the importance of using your data to guide your service development. And I know that it's really scary to share data. And, you know, the YW and CWES, we didn't share identifying data. But, you know, the aggregate data, themes and trends, being on top of that, being better able to tell your story and your impact is more important now than it ever was before. And I think, like for CWES, we were monitoring our data and our stats daily. And then we moved to weekly, but we were looking for those themes and trends, and to be able to provide that context, because you also have to tell the story with your data. And because just because shelters were had lower admissions doesn't mean they're not important or that they weren't needed. I think our voice is important to be able to tell the context of why those numbers were low and why we thought they were going to come higher later, which of course is playing out. So I think being on top of your data, being in control of it, being able to understand the context and the narrative, and also be able to be reflective and look at what you might need to change if the data says certain things. So there were lots of changes that came about at CWES and the YW based on what we found in Shelter 2.0. And some of it was not easy. Some staff, you know, really didn't like some of the changes. And so we did have some turnover. And I think COVID's going to be a similar kind of a experience, where we're going to be requiring people to work digitally, or, you know, in engaging in other ways that maybe they're not quite comfortable with. And I think there needs to be a much more collaborative stance. And I think we need to celebrate when agencies create great things or innovative things. There's been so much competition and challenge between, you know, different parts of the sector. And I think the time for that is done. I get quite tired of hearing, you know, people putting down other projects that might be really innovative or exciting. Certainly, it's, you know, share your feedback around what the risks might be, or what your experience might be. But we've got to start moving towards working together better and celebrating the successes in the sector, and seeing us all on the same team, rather than, oh, they're in this part of the sector, or you're in that part of the sector. We're all doing the same work. We're doing it from a different perspective, and we're doing it different ways, but we really need to be working together. And to me, Shelter 2.0 was a really nice example of, you know, two major organizations, like with, you know, a similar size and so on, being vulnerable, sharing our data, working together with what that meant. And then we each have an implementation team right now. So we're going to be coming back together, and we touch base periodically to share how this is working for us. And I think it's that kind of ongoing reflection and connection that is going to make the difference in our ability to continue to be able to respond. I also think the conversations are becoming far more public around family violence. And so it's not in the shadows the way it always was. We can't control the narrative, and the public is becoming very well educated on this. And so we have to be able to be in that with them in a way that is meaningful. So the new normal, most agencies and clients are going to discover that they can access support digitally. And, you know, I think even for me, I kind of like working at home. I don't have to fight the traffic and get to parking and so on. And some of the meetings can be just as effective with Zoom, although there is Zoom fatigue. But even when things relaunch, and I say that gently because shelters never stopped working, so it's not really a relaunch, but as the world relaunches and reopens, it's all going to be different. And so I think, you know, one of the learnings from Shelter 2.0 was really trying to create this openness to the possibilities. And how do you be digitally responsive and blend these worlds? And how is your agency going to show up and handle these different ways of working as we go forward? I think that if anyone's familiar with spiral dynamics, I won't get into all that, but we do a lot of work at CWES about looking at what stage of development is our organization? What stage of development are our teams at? And, you know, looking at our own leadership and where are we at? And how do you, you know, how do you move your organization forward to this new way of being? Because it is going to be very, very different. And some organizations are not going to be standing at the end of it. We've already seen there's mergers happening. We've seen some agencies shut their doors already. So how are we going to embrace this new way of being in a way that our organizations continue to be able to provide the great service that they've been providing? And that means we need to lead differently as well. So that piece about earlier about collaborating, it's, yes, you have to support your agency and look out for your agency, but it's supposed to be about the clients. It's supposed to be about the work that we're doing together. And so, and really that, to me, that was one of the big themes of Shelter 2.0. It's about the clients, and we are just tools to create great outcomes. And I believe it's on us to partner well and work well together. There's going to be a need for more coordinated intake and approach. And this is not comfortable for agencies because, again, the data piece, and I've heard people say, like when the shelter groups in Calgary were looking at the coordinated or the one line, you know, the criticism was, well, then whoever owns the line is going to have all the clients. Well, there's not a lot of glory in that. There's enough clients to go around. There was no, like, that's a kind of a silly kind of argument for why you wouldn't want to coordinate your intake, right? Certainly there's an element of, you know, there's choice in there, but if you've got a good collaborative and you're really working through some of those issues, it shouldn't be it shouldn't be a problem. There's plenty of work for all of us. I don't know about you, but we have waiting lists for everything. And I'm sure most agencies do right now. And so COVID-19, specifically for shelters, created a really challenging context for how do people come in. As you know, with people social distancing, self-isolating in homes where they were with someone who was abusive, they couldn't get out to use the phone. And so, we need to create new, even aggressive, I talk about outreach and engagement opportunities. Because before, when I think about how my outreach team has worked in the past, they haven't had to do aggressive outreach. Not like in the, well, I'll date myself. In the old days when we would like walk the streets and be doing, community outreach, they don't have to do that because you've got a wait list and clients are calling and they just get referred to outreach. And so now I think we're going to have to be going backwards a little bit and reconnect with those old strategies of how do you make yourself visible and accessible to people that are facing different kinds of barriers. And I don't think that's going to change. I think that there's no vaccine in the near future, and so there's going to be certainly a relaunch of sorts, but there will always be, for the next while anyway, some measure of this social distancing and modified ways of being in community and being in the world. And so so agencies are going to need to really rethink how they connect, right? And how they make that first step. And so digitally, that's one thing to offer services, but then how do you really engage people digitally? Not very many people do that well. So it's going to be a challenge. And we're going to have to push ourselves to communicate differently. We're no longer going to have our interagency meetings all in one room, one crowded room, breathing the same air, all close together. And so how do you make and build new relationships and network with other agencies that you're going to need to work with? I just finished doing a plan for a leadership development plan for myself, for my board. And one of the targets is like government relations. Well, how do you build relationships with new government people when you can't be in person, right? So it's a whole new way of thinking about it. It's the same kind of thing for clients. How do we create that comfort for them to come in and connect with us when we don't have the same mechanisms we've had in the past? And then I think the other thing is real-time data is needed. So I talked about earlier how CWES reviews our data, like we did it day over day and then moved to week over week. We're going to have to get better at tracking and measuring outcomes and measuring and understanding what the data is telling us in a shorter time frame so that we can be responsive. It used to be you could do quality improvement cycles every 4 times a year, reflect that information back to your team, make those changes, and you're all good. But with things like COVID, it was changing daily. And I'm sure most of you on this call were probably called to all those mandatory meetings. All of a sudden you got an hour notice on a Saturday afternoon, you got to be on a call. And so we really do need to be on top of our data differently and be able to be responsive and help guide that conversation about what's happening. So it's not just happening to us, but that we're in that helping guide what needs to happen with services for our clients and for our agencies as well. So that's sort of my summary of Shelter 2.0 in a nutshell and sort of how it's impacted CWES as we move forward with COVID. And yeah, I'd welcome any questions.